I could smell the salt before I saw the water through the fog. The ferry's engine coughed and sputtered as Joel Quinn guided us toward what I hoped was Clearwater Island Resort. My duffel bag sat between my boots, everything I'd need for the next 4 months packed into one worn canvas sack. "First time out here?" Joel asked, not taking his eyes off the gray water ahead. "Yeah, looking forward to it." Joel made a sound that might have been a laugh. "Island's different from the mainland. No quick trips to town when you get restless. No cell service past the dock. Ferry runs twice a week if the weather cooperates." The fog started to thin, revealing dark shapes that turned into pine trees rising from rocky shores. A wooden pier stretched into the water, and beyond it I could make out a cluster of buildings tucked between the forest and a small beach. "That's it," Joel said, cutting the engine back. "Clearwater Resort. Been running seasonal help out here for 15 years. Some love it, some last 2 weeks before they're begging for a ride back." "Which one do you think I'll be?" Joel glanced at me for the first time since we'd left the mainland. His weathered face showed no expression. "Hard to say. You seem steady enough. But the island gets to people different ways. Some folks start hearing things in the trees at night. Others just get cabin fever from being stuck with the same 5 people day after day." The ferry bumped against the pier with a hollow thud. Joel threw a rope around a wooden post and gestured toward the dock. "Andrea's probably waiting for you up at the main lodge. She runs things here." I shouldered my duffel bag and stepped onto the pier. The wood felt solid under my boots, but I could hear water lapping against the supports below. Joel was already untying the rope. "Next ferry's Thursday," he said. "Weather permitting. Thanks for the ride." Joel nodded and pushed off from the pier. I watched the ferry disappear back into the fog before turning toward the buildings ahead. A gravel path led from the dock through a stand of tall pines to a large wooden lodge with green shutters. Smaller cabins dotted the area around it, connected by more gravel paths that disappeared into the trees. The front door of the lodge opened before I reached it. A woman in her 40s stepped out, blonde hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, wearing a blue blouse and khakis that looked freshly pressed. "You must be Parker," she said, extending her hand. "Andrea Burgess. Welcome to Clearwater Resort." Her grip was firm and professional. "Thanks. Good to be here. How was the crossing? Joel didn't scare you off with his doom and gloom routine, did he? He mentioned the island can be isolating." Andrea laughed. "Joel's been saying that for years. He thinks anyone under 50 is going to have a nervous breakdown the moment they lose their Wi-Fi connection. Come on, I'll show you around and get you settled." She led me up a set of wooden steps to the lodge's wraparound porch. Through the windows, I could see a dining room with round tables covered in white tablecloths, and beyond that, a sitting area with leather chairs arranged around a stone fireplace. "We're running about 60% capacity this season," Andrea said, opening the front door. "Mostly weekend guests from Seattle and Portland, couples looking for a quiet getaway, families wanting to disconnect for a few days. Nothing too demanding." The interior smelled like pine cleaner and coffee. A young woman with dark hair and a ponytail was wiping down tables in the dining room. She looked up and waved when she saw us. "That's Betty Perry," Andrea said. "She handles kitchen prep and dining room service. You'll meet the rest of the crew in a minute." We walked through the dining room toward a hallway lined with framed photographs of the island. Most showed the same views I'd seen from the ferry: pine forests, rocky beaches, the wooden pier stretching into gray water. "The island's about 2 miles long and half a mile wide," Andrea said. "Resort property covers the southern third. The rest is mostly forest and a few old cabins that haven't been used in years. Guests sometimes hike the trails, but most prefer to stay close to the lodge." A door at the end of the hallway opened and 2 men walked in, both wearing work clothes and carrying coffee mugs. The taller one had dark hair and moved with the easy confidence of someone comfortable with physical work. The shorter one had black hair and a friendly face that lit up when he saw us. "Perfect timing," Andrea said. "Parker, meet Harrison Hunt and Caden Walker. Harrison will be your roommate, and Caden handles housekeeping. Harrison stepped forward first, setting down his coffee mug to shake my hand. Good to meet you. Ready to get your hands dirty? That's why I'm here. Caden grinned and shook my hand next. His grip was warm and calloused. Welcome to paradise, man. Hope you like the smell of pine trees, because that's about all you're going to smell for the next 4 months. Better than car exhaust. That's the spirit, Andrea said. Let me show you to your cabin, then we'll go over your duties. We left the lodge through a side door and followed another gravel path into the trees. The fog was lifting, revealing more of the island's layout. I counted 6 guest cabins scattered through the pines, each with its own small porch and windows facing different directions. At the far end of the path sat a larger cabin with 2 entrances. Staff quarters, Andrea said, pulling a key from her pocket. You and Harrison have the place to yourselves. Caden and Betty have the cabin next door. The interior was simple but comfortable. 2 bedrooms separated by a small living area with a couch, table, and kitchenette. Harrison pushed open the door to the left bedroom. I took this one when I got here last month, but we can switch if you want. This is fine, I said, looking into the right bedroom. Single bed, dresser, small window facing the forest. Everything I needed. I dropped my duffel bag on the bed and followed them back outside. Andrea was checking something on her phone. Your main responsibilities will be grounds maintenance and dock repairs, she said. Harrison can show you where we keep the tools and equipment. Breakfast is at 7, lunch at noon, dinner at 6. Guests usually eat around the same time, so try to schedule any noisy work for mid-morning or mid-afternoon. Sounds straightforward. It is. This isn't a high-pressure job, Parker. Keep the grass trimmed, fix anything that breaks. Help guests with their luggage when the ferry comes in. Most of the time, you'll have the place to yourselves. Harrison nodded toward a small building behind the staff cabins. Tool sheds over there. We've got everything you'll need. Lawn mowers, hedge trimmers, basic repair tools. The dock needs some attention on the far side where the winter storms beat it up. I'll show you tomorrow, Andrea said. For now, get settled and meet everyone properly. Dinner's in an hour. She headed back toward the lodge, leaving me with Harrison. He seemed easy enough to work with, not the type to make a big deal about sharing space or splitting duties. So, what brought you out here? Harrison asked as we walked back toward the cabin. Needed a change of scenery. Figured 4 months on an island sounded better than another summer in the city. Yeah, I get that. I was working construction in Portland before this. Same thing every day. Traffic, noise, people everywhere. This is better. How long have you been here? About a month. Started in May when they opened for the season. It's good work if you don't mind being cut off from everything. We spent the next hour unpacking my things and talking about the job. Harrison had a relaxed way about him that made the conversation easy. He'd already figured out the rhythms of the place. When guests were most likely to need help, which areas required the most maintenance, how to stay out of Andrea's way when she was dealing with problems. Dinner was in the lodge dining room with the full staff. Betty had prepared grilled salmon with vegetables from a garden behind the kitchen. Caden kept everyone laughing with stories about guests who'd arrived expecting luxury accommodations and found themselves sharing bathrooms with spiders. Last weekend, we had a couple from Seattle who wanted to know where the spa was, Betty said, refilling my coffee cup. I told them the spa was the lake, and the massage therapist was a paddle. Did they stay? 3 days, spent most of it complaining about the Wi-Fi. Andrea smiled but didn't join the conversation. She ate quickly and excused herself to handle paperwork in her office. The rest of us lingered over coffee as the sky outside the windows faded from gray to black. You'll like it here, Caden said as we finally cleared the table. Takes a few days to get used to the quiet, but then you start sleeping better than you have in years. The silence is the best part, Betty added. No sirens, no traffic, no neighbors playing music at all hours, just wind and water. Harrison walked back to the cabin with me, pointing out landmarks in the dark. The guest cabins were lit by small porch lights that created pools of yellow in the trees. Beyond them, The forest was completely black. "Guests usually turn in early," Harrison said. "Not much to do after dark except read or play cards. Some of them bring board games." "What do you do?" "Read, mostly. Sometimes walk down to the dock and listen to the water. It's peaceful." The first week passed exactly as advertised. I settled into a routine of lawn maintenance and small repairs that kept me busy without being demanding. The guests were mostly middle-aged couples who wanted help with their luggage and directions to the hiking trails. They ate their meals quietly, took pictures of the scenery, and left on the Thursday ferry looking relaxed. Harrison and I worked well together. He knew which areas needed attention and how to fix problems without making them worse. We replaced several loose boards on the dock, trimmed hedges around the guest cabins, and repaired a section of fence that had been damaged by falling branches. The island itself was more beautiful than I'd expected. When the fog lifted, I could see mountains on the mainland rising from dark water. Seals sunned themselves on rocks near the shore, and eagles circled overhead looking for fish. The trails through the forest led to small clearings with views of hidden coves and beaches covered in driftwood. By my 8th day, I felt like I'd found exactly what I'd been looking for. The work was satisfying. My co-workers were good company, and the isolation that Joel had warned me about felt more like freedom than confinement. I was trimming hedges near the forest edge that morning when I first saw her. The hedge ran along the boundary between the resort property and the wild part of the island, a neat line of green that separated the maintained grounds from the tangle of trees and undergrowth beyond. I'd been working steadily for about an hour, cutting back growth that had encroached on the path during the spring rains. The hedge trimmer was loud enough that I had to pause occasionally to listen for guests who might be walking nearby. During one of these pauses, I noticed movement between the trees. At first I thought it might be a deer. The island had a small population that sometimes wandered close to the resort looking for food. But when I looked more carefully, I realized it was a person. A woman stood motionless about 50 yards into the forest, perfectly still among the dark tree trunks. She wore a bright red dress that stood out against the green and brown of the woods, like a splash of paint on a canvas. The dress looked formal, almost elegant, completely out of place in the wilderness setting. I set down the hedge trimmer and wiped sweat from my forehead. The woman hadn't moved since I'd first noticed her. She stood with her arms at her sides, facing directly toward me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. "Hello," I called out, raising my voice to carry across the distance. No response. She remained perfectly still, like a statue placed among the trees. I couldn't make out her features clearly from where I stood, but I could tell she was looking at me with unwavering focus. I took a few steps closer to the forest edge, stopping at the boundary where the maintained grounds ended and the wild growth began. "Are you okay?" Still nothing. The woman continued to stare without moving, without acknowledging my voice in any way. The red dress hung perfectly straight as if there was no breeze in the forest to disturb it. Something about her stillness unsettled me. People didn't stand that motionless, that focused, without some kind of purpose. I'd never seen any of the guests wear anything like that red dress, and I couldn't imagine why someone would hike into the forest wearing formal clothes. I waited several more minutes, watching for any sign of movement or response. The woman remained exactly as I'd first seen her, arms at her sides, face turned toward me, red dress bright against the dark trees. The longer I watched, the more uncomfortable I became. Finally, I picked up the hedge trimmer and returned to work. The noise of the motor filled the air, drowning out the forest sounds. I kept glancing toward the trees as I worked, checking to see if the woman was still there. When I looked again 10 minutes later, she had vanished completely. I needed to tell someone about what I'd seen, The woman in the red dress had been bothering me all afternoon, and by the time we headed back to our cabin for dinner, I couldn't keep it to myself anymore. Harrison was already pulling ingredients out of the small refrigerator when I walked through the door. Our cabin was basic but functional. 2 beds, a kitchenette, a table with 2 chairs, and a bathroom barely big enough to turn around in. The resort had provided the essentials, and we'd added a few personal touches over the past week. Harrison had tacked up a photo of his family back in Oregon, and I'd left a paperback novel on the nightstand between our beds. "You want pasta tonight?" Harrison asked, holding up a box of spaghetti. "I grabbed some sauce from the kitchen earlier." "Sure." I sat down at the table and watched him move around the small space. Harrison was efficient in the kitchen, probably from living on his own during college. He filled a pot with water and set it on the stove, then opened a jar of marinara sauce. I waited until he had everything going before I brought it up. "Hey, you know when we were working on the north side today?" "Yeah." Harrison stirred the sauce with a wooden spoon. "What about it?" "I saw someone in the woods. A woman." Harrison glanced over his shoulder at me. "Okay, probably just a guest. She was wearing this bright red dress. Like, formal, not hiking clothes." "So?" He turned back to the stove. "Rich people wear weird stuff sometimes. Remember that guy yesterday with the designer boots? Probably cost more than we make in a month." The water started bubbling, and Harrison added the pasta. I watched him work, trying to figure out how to explain what had bothered me so much about the encounter. "She wasn't moving," I said finally. "What do you mean?" "I mean, she stood there for like 25 minutes without moving at all, just staring at me." Harrison laughed. "Come on, 25 minutes? You were working. Time probably felt longer than it was." I checked my watch. I looked at her, worked for a while, looked again. She was in the exact same position. Maybe she was on her phone or something, taking pictures. I shook my head. She didn't have a phone. Her hands were just hanging at her sides, and when I tried to call out to her, she didn't respond at all. Harrison drained the pasta and mixed it with the sauce. He divided it between 2 bowls and brought them to the table, sitting across from me. "Look, Parker, these guests pay a lot of money to be here. Some of them are probably pretty eccentric. Maybe she was meditating or doing some kind of nature thing. Rich people are into weird stuff like that." I picked up my fork but didn't start eating right away. She disappeared. What? When I looked again, she was gone. No sound, nothing. 1 second she was there, the next she wasn't. Harrison took a bite of pasta and chewed thoughtfully. "She probably just walked back to the trail when you weren't looking. The forest is thick in there. Easy to lose sight of someone." "I would have heard her moving through the trees." "Not necessarily. You had the hedge trimmer going most of the time, right? And I was running that sprinkler repair. Between the 2 of us, we were making plenty of noise." I wanted to argue with him, but I couldn't. He was right about the noise. The hedge trimmer wasn't exactly quiet, and Harrison had been cursing at the broken sprinkler head for most of the afternoon. Maybe I wouldn't have heard footsteps. "I guess," I said. "Trust me, it was just a guest. Probably got lost and didn't want to admit it when you called out. Some of these people have serious pride issues." Harrison seemed completely unconcerned. He ate his pasta and talked about the work we had planned for tomorrow, fixing a loose board on the main dock and checking the irrigation system on the south lawn. Normal, everyday stuff. His casual attitude made me feel a little ridiculous for being so worked up about the woman. After dinner, we played cards for a while and watched a movie on Harrison's laptop. He acted like our conversation had never happened, joking around and talking about his plans for the money he was saving. By the time we went to bed, I'd almost convinced myself he was right. Just a guest who'd wandered off the marked trails. But I still had trouble sleeping that night. The next 3 days passed without incident. Harrison and I fell back into our routine: breakfast with Caden and Betty, a full day of maintenance work, dinner, and cards in the evening. I helped Harrison fix the dockboard, and we spent a morning clearing brush from around the activity center. Normal work that kept my hands busy and my mind occupied. I didn't see the woman again, and I started to think Harrison had been right all along. Maybe I'd let the isolation get to me more than I'd realized. Joel's warning about the island changing people had stuck with me, and maybe I'd been looking for problems that weren't there. On Thursday morning, Harrison and I were assigned to work on the boat dock. A few of the support posts needed reinforcing, and the decking had some loose boards that were becoming a safety hazard. Andrea had made it clear that guest safety was our top priority, especially around the water. The dock extended about 40 feet into the bay, with slips for 6 boats. Only 3 were occupied. A couple of sailboats and a small motorboat that belonged to one of the families staying in cabin 12. The water was calm that morning, barely lapping against the dock supports. Harrison worked on tightening the bolts that secured the dock to the support posts, while I replaced a section of decking near the end. The work required focus. One wrong step, and I'd end up in the water with a toolbox. I measured each board carefully, marked my cuts, and used the circular saw to trim them to size. We'd been working for about 2 hours when I straightened up to stretch my back. The morning fog had burned off completely, leaving the bay clear and bright under the sun. I could see across to the mainland, a hazy line of trees and buildings in the distance. That's when I saw her. She stood at the edge of the forest, maybe 60 yards from where I was working. The same woman, wearing the same bright red dress. The fabric seemed to glow against the dark green of the pine trees behind her, like someone had lit her with a spotlight. I dropped my hammer. It hit the dock with a loud clang and rolled toward the edge. "Careful," Harrison called from behind me. He was still focused on the support post, his back turned toward the shore. The woman was staring directly at me, just like before. Her arms hung straight at her sides, and she stood perfectly still. Even from this distance, I could feel her eyes on me. "Harrison." "What?" "Look toward the trees. Do you see her?" Harrison glanced up from his work and followed my gaze toward the forest. He looked for a few seconds, then went back to his bolt. "See who?" "The woman in the red dress. She's right there." Harrison looked again, longer this time. "I don't see anyone, Parker." I stared at him. "She's standing right at the tree line. Bright red dress, long dark hair. There's nobody there." I turned back toward the forest. The woman was still there, motionless as a statue. The red dress was impossible to miss against the green background. "You're telling me you don't see a woman in a red dress standing between those 2 big pine trees?" Harrison set down his wrench and stood up. He walked over to where I was standing and looked carefully in the direction I was pointing. "Parker, there's nobody there. Just trees." My heart started beating faster. Either Harrison was lying to me or something was seriously wrong. I could see her as clearly as I could see Harrison standing next to me. "I'm going over there," I said. "What? Why?" I didn't answer. I grabbed the edge of the dock and swung myself up onto the shore, then started walking toward the forest. Behind me, I heard Harrison calling my name, but I didn't stop. The woman watched me approach. She didn't move, didn't blink, didn't react at all as I got closer. Her face was pale and expressionless, and her dark hair hung straight down past her shoulders. The red dress looked expensive, like something someone would wear to a formal dinner or a theater performance. Definitely not appropriate for hiking through the woods. I was maybe 20 yards away when she vanished. Not walked away, not stepped behind a tree. Vanished. 1 second she was there, solid and real, and the next second there was nothing but empty forest. I stopped walking and stared at the spot where she'd been standing. 2 large pine trees with a small gap between them, exactly where I'd seen her. I approached slowly, looking for any sign that someone had been there. The ground was covered with a thick layer of pine needles and fallen leaves. I knelt down and examined the area carefully. brushing aside the debris to look at the soil underneath. If someone had been standing there should have been some kind of impression. A footprint, a disturbed patch of ground, something. There was nothing. I spent 10 minutes searching the area around the trees, looking for any evidence that the woman had been there. No footprints, no broken branches, no disturbed vegetation. The forest floor looked completely undisturbed, like no one had walked through it in months. "Parker!" Harrison's voice carried across the clearing. "What are you doing?" I stood up and brushed the dirt off my knees. Harrison was standing on the dock, hands on his hips, watching me with a confused expression. "Looking for footprints," I called back. "Find any?" "No." I walked back toward the dock, my mind racing. Either I was losing my grip on reality or something very strange was happening on this island. The woman had been real. I was sure of it. I'd seen her clearly in broad daylight from less than 20 yards away, but Harrison couldn't see her, and she'd left no trace of her presence. "You okay?" Harrison asked when I climbed back onto the dock. "Yeah, I'm fine." But I wasn't fine. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, unable to stop thinking about the woman in the red dress. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her pale face and expressionless stare. Sleep came in short, restless intervals, broken by dreams I couldn't quite remember when I woke up. The next day, I had trouble concentrating on work. Harrison and I were supposed to repair a section of fence near the activity center, but I kept glancing toward the forest, half expecting to see the woman watching me from between the trees. Harrison noticed my distraction, but didn't say anything about it. He just picked up the slack, working with the same steady efficiency he'd shown since I'd arrived on the island. But something had changed between us. Harrison's casual dismissal of what I'd seen, his complete inability to see the woman when she was standing right there in plain sight. It bothered me more than I wanted to admit. Either he was lying to me for some reason, or I was seeing things that weren't there. Neither possibility was particularly comforting. That evening, while we prepared dinner, Harrison acted like nothing had happened. He talked about his plans for the weekend, mentioned a letter he'd gotten from his sister back home, asked if I wanted to join him and the others for a card game after we ate. Normal conversation, friendly and relaxed. I wanted to bring up the woman again, to try to make him understand what I'd seen. But every time I started to speak, I stopped myself. What was the point? He'd already made it clear he thought I was imagining things. Pushing the issue would only make me look more unstable, so I kept quiet and tried to act normal. But the woman's image stayed with me, clear and vivid in my memory. The bright red dress, the pale skin, the way she'd stared at me without blinking, and the complete silence when she disappeared like she'd never been there at all. Something was happening on this island, something Harrison either couldn't see or didn't want to acknowledge, and I was starting to realize that I might be facing it alone. Harrison brought up the boat trip during breakfast on Friday morning. I was picking at my eggs, still distracted from yesterday's fence work, when he dropped his fork onto his plate with a clatter. "We should take the motorboat out this weekend," he said. "Check out the coastline from the water." Betty looked up from her coffee. "Are we allowed to use the boats?" "Andrea mentioned it during orientation," Harrison said. "Staff can use the motorboat for recreation as long as we clear it with her first and don't take it during guest hours." Caden nodded, cutting into his pancakes. "Sounds good to me. I've been wanting to see more of the island." I hadn't been thinking about boat trips. My mind kept drifting back to the woman in red, the way she'd vanished without leaving any trace. But maybe Harrison was right about getting off the property for a while. Maybe some time away from the trees and the dock would help clear my head. "Yeah, okay," I said. "When were you thinking?" "This afternoon. Weather's supposed to be perfect." Harrison was already planning it out, talking about checking the fuel level and life jackets. He seemed more animated than he'd been in days, like the idea of getting on the water had given him something to focus on. I watched him gesture toward the marina, explaining which boat we'd take and how long we could stay out. "I'll ask Andrea after breakfast," he said. "But I'm pretty sure she'll say yes. Not like we have much else to do on our day off." Betty finished her coffee and stood up. "I should get the lunch dishes prepped before we go. Maria's covering for me, but I want to make sure everything's ready." "I can help," Caden offered. "Thanks, but I've got it. Just meet at the dock around 2. We all agreed, and I felt something loosen in my chest. Maybe this was exactly what I needed. Time away from the grounds, away from the forest edge where I kept expecting to see that red dress. Just normal time with my coworkers, doing something that had nothing to do with mysterious women or missing footprints. Harrison cleared our plates while I finished my orange juice. "You seem better today," he said. "Better how?" "Less distracted. Yesterday you kept looking over your shoulder while we worked on that fence." I hadn't realized he'd noticed. "Just tired, I guess." "Well, a few hours on the water should fix that. Nothing like being out on the bay to clear your head." After breakfast, Harrison went to find Andrea while the rest of us finished our morning tasks. I helped Caden change the sheets in cabins 7 and 8, and by the time we finished, Harrison was back with permission to take the boat out until 5 o'clock. "She said to stay within sight of the island and keep the radio on channel 16, he reported. "And we have to check in every hour." The afternoon was perfect for being on the water. No clouds, light breeze, temperature in the mid-70s. Harrison had already checked the boat by the time we met at the dock, testing the engine and making sure we had enough fuel for a few hours of cruising. The motorboat was a 22-foot center console with bench seating for 6 people. Harrison had laid out life jackets on the seats and was checking the radio when we arrived. "Everyone know how to swim?" he asked. We all confirmed we could handle ourselves in the water, though Betty mentioned she wasn't the strongest swimmer. Harrison assigned her a spot in the middle of the boat where she'd be safest and showed her how to adjust her life jacket. "We'll just cruise around the perimeter," he said, starting the engine. "See what the island looks like from offshore." I untied the dock lines while Caden pushed us away from the pier. Harrison eased the throttle forward, and we moved slowly out of the marina before picking up speed in the open water. The island looked different from the bay. Smaller somehow, but also more dramatic with the cliffs and rocky shoreline rising directly from the water. Harrison followed the southern coast first, pointing out landmarks we recognized from our work on the grounds. "There's the activity center," Betty called out, shading her eyes with her hand. The building looked tiny from the water, nestled among the trees with just the roof and upper walls visible. We could see the main lodge too, and some of the guest cabins scattered through the forest. "Hard to believe we've been here almost 2 weeks, Caden said. Harrison steered us along the western shore, where the cliffs were highest. The water was deep blue here, and I could see rocks and kelp beds through the clear surface. A few seals watched us from a rocky outcrop, then slipped into the water as we passed. "This is great," Betty said. "I had no idea how beautiful it was from out here." For the first time in days, I felt relaxed. The engine noise and the wind made conversation difficult, so mostly we just watched the coastline slide by. Harrison seemed comfortable at the wheel, keeping us at a safe distance from the rocks while giving us good views of the island's features. We were about an hour into the trip when Harrison turned us toward the northern point. This was the side of the island I knew least well, since our work kept us mostly around the resort buildings and southern docks. The shoreline here was different too, with more beaches and less dramatic cliffs. Harrison slowed the engine as we rounded the point, and I moved to the bow to get a better view of the northern coast. The trees came right down to the water here, with a narrow strip of rocky beach between the forest and the bay. That's when I saw her. The woman in the red dress stood at the water's edge, maybe 50 yards from where the waves lapped against the rocks. Even from the boat, that bright red color was unmistakable against the dark green of the pine trees behind her. My stomach dropped. She was here too, not just in the forest near our work sites. Wherever I went on this island, she appeared. I was about to turn and tell the others when I heard Harrison's voice behind me. "Jesus," he said quietly. I looked back. Harrison was staring toward shore, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles had gone white. His face had lost all its color. He could see her. After 2 encounters where he'd insisted no one was there, Harrison was finally seeing the woman in red. "What is it?" Caden asked, following Harrison's stare. "On the beach," Harrison said. "Do you see her?" Betty shaded her eyes again, squinting toward shore. "See who?" "The woman in red, right there at the water." Caden looked where Harrison was pointing. "I don't see anyone," but Harrison definitely did. He was already turning the wheel, steering us toward shore. The engine noise dropped to an idle as we approached the rocky beach. "Harrison, what are you doing?" Betty asked. "There's someone on the beach. We should check if she needs help." I watched Harrison's face as he maneuvered the boat closer to shore. His easy confidence from earlier was completely gone. He looked shaken, maybe even scared, but also determined to reach the woman. "I still don't see anyone," Caden said. Harrison didn't respond. He was focused entirely on the shore, on the figure in red that only he and I could see. When we were about 20 feet from the beach, he cut the engine and dropped the anchor. "I'm going ashore," he said. "Harrison, wait," I started to say, but he was already pulling off his shoes and rolling up his pants legs. "Just stay with the boat. I'll be right back." "Want me to come with you?" I asked. "No, stay here." Harrison swung his legs over the side and dropped into the water, which came up to his knees. He waded toward shore, moving carefully over the rocky bottom. I watched him approach the woman who remained perfectly still at the water's edge. From the boat, I couldn't make out her features clearly, but I could see that bright red dress and her pale skin. She stood with her back partially toward us, looking out over the water. "What's he doing?" Betty asked. "I'm not sure," I said. Harrison reached the beach and walked toward the woman. When he was about 10 feet away, he stopped and seemed to be saying something. I couldn't hear his words over the sound of waves against the rocks, but I could see his mouth moving. The woman turned toward him. Even from the boat, I could tell she was facing Harrison directly, the same way she'd stared at me in the forest. Harrison stood completely still, like he'd been frozen in place. They stayed like that for several minutes, Harrison rigid on the beach, the woman facing him without any visible movement, no gestures, no conversation that I could detect. Just 2 figures standing motionless while the waves rolled in around Harrison's feet. "This is weird," Caden said. "How long is he going to stand there?" I didn't answer. I was watching Harrison's posture, the way he held himself like he was afraid to move. Whatever the woman was saying to him, or whatever was happening between them, it wasn't a normal conversation. After what felt like 10 minutes, Harrison suddenly turned and walked back toward the water. He moved quickly, almost urgently, wading out to the boat without looking back at the woman. "Help me up," he said when he reached the side. Caden and I pulled him into the boat. Harrison's hands were shaking as he started the engine, and when I looked back toward shore, the woman was gone. "Harrison, who was that?" Betty asked. "Just someone who got separated from her group," Harrison said. "She's fine." But his voice sounded strained, and he wouldn't look at any of us directly. He pulled up the anchor and steered us away from the beach, giving the engine more throttle than necessary. "Did you recognize her?" I asked. "Was she one of the guests?" "I don't know. Maybe." Harrison's usual easy conversation was completely gone. He answered our questions with short responses and kept his eyes on the water ahead of us. His hands continued to shake slightly as he gripped the wheel. We finished the trip in relative silence, following the eastern shore back toward the marina. Harrison checked in with the resort on the radio, reporting our position in a voice that sounded forced and normal, but the relaxed mood from earlier was completely destroyed. When we tied up at the dock, Harrison was the first one out of the boat. "Thanks for coming," he said. That was fun. But nothing about his behavior suggested he'd had fun. He helped secure the boat and put away the life jackets, but he moved like he was eager to get away from the water. "You okay?" I asked him as we walked back toward the cabins. "Fine, just tired." I knew he was lying. Harrison had seen the woman in red, and whatever had happened during those 10 minutes on the beach had shaken him badly. His hands were still trembling slightly as we reached our cabin door. I stared at Harrison as he climbed back into bed like nothing had happened. He pulled the covers up to his chin and closed his eyes, settling into his pillow with the same casual movements he'd made every night for weeks. "Where were you?" I asked. "What do you mean?" His voice was muffled by the pillow. "You were gone. I woke up and your bed was empty." Harrison rolled over to face me. Even in the dim light from the window, I could see his confused expression. "I've been here all night, man. You must have been dreaming." I sat up straighter. "I looked for you. I went outside and found you standing in the woods behind the cabin. That's impossible." Harrison propped himself up on one elbow. "I haven't left this room since we got back from dinner." The certainty in his voice made my skin crawl. He wasn't lying. At least he didn't think he was lying. But I'd spent 20 minutes watching him stand perfectly still between those pine trees, calling his name over and over while he ignored me completely. "You were facing the forest," I said. "Just standing there. You wouldn't answer when I called you." Harrison shook his head. "Parker, I think you're having some kind of stress reaction. Maybe the isolation is getting to you more than you realize." There it was again, the same dismissive tone he'd used when I told him about seeing the woman in red, the same suggestion that my mind was playing tricks on me. "I know what I saw. Look, I get it. This place can mess with your head. Joel warned you about that on the ferry, right?" Harrison lay back down. "But I've been asleep for hours. Check my side of the room if you want. My shoes are still by the door, exactly where I left them." I looked toward the door. His work boots sat in their usual spot, laces tucked inside. But that didn't prove anything. He could have put them back. "Just try to get some sleep," Harrison said. "We've got that irrigation repair in the morning." I lay back down but didn't close my eyes. Something was wrong with Harrison, and it had started the moment we'd taken that boat trip. Ever since he'd waded onto that beach and approached the woman in red, he'd been different. The changes had been subtle at first. The day after the boat trip, Harrison had suggested we skip lunch with Caden and Betty, claiming we needed to finish the dock repairs before the weekend guests arrived. When I mentioned grabbing dinner at the lodge instead of cooking in the cabin, he'd insisted we had plenty of food and didn't need to bother the kitchen staff. "We should keep to ourselves more," he'd said while heating up leftover pasta. "The other staff members have their own responsibilities. We don't want to be a distraction." That wasn't like Harrison at all. He'd been the one organizing group dinners and card games since my first week. But when I pointed that out, he'd just shrugged and said he was trying to be more professional. The isolation had gotten worse over the next few days. Harrison found reasons for us to work in remote areas of the resort, away from the main buildings, where we might run into Caden or Betty. When Caden stopped by our cabin one evening to invite us for a movie night in the lodge, Harrison had claimed we were both too tired and practically shut the door in his face. "What was that about?" I'd asked. "We see them enough during work hours," Harrison had replied. "We don't need to spend every free minute together, too." But the strangest part was how Harrison had started shadowing me during our work shifts. Before the boat trip, we'd often split up to cover more ground, one of us working on the north side of the resort, while the other handled tasks in the south. Now Harrison insisted we stay together for everything, even simple jobs that would be faster with divided labor. "It's safer this way," he'd explained when I suggested we each take half the cabins for the weekly maintenance checks. "If something goes wrong, we'll have backup." Nothing had ever gone wrong during routine maintenance. But Harrison seemed genuinely anxious about the possibility of us working separately, checking over his shoulder whenever I moved more than a few feet away from him. The boat incident had been the final confirmation that something was seriously off. 3 days ago, Andrea had asked us to perform the monthly engine check on the motorboat we'd used for our coastal trip. Standard procedure. Check the oil, test the electrical systems, make sure everything was running smoothly for guest use. Harrison had volunteered to handle the engine while I inspected the hull and deck hardware. I'd been checking the anchor winch when I heard him working below, the sound of metal on metal echoing from the engine compartment. "How's it looking down there?" I'd called. "Fine, just tightening a few connections." But when I'd climbed down to check his progress, I'd found Harrison using a wrench on the fuel line connection, loosening it instead of tightening it. Fuel was already dripping onto the engine block. "Harrison, stop. You're loosening that, not tightening it." He'd looked up at me with a startled expression, like he'd been caught doing something he shouldn't. "What? No, I'm just..." "The fuel line. You've loosened the connection, look." Harrison had stared at the dripping fuel for a long moment, then quickly tightened the connection back down. "Sorry, I got confused about which way to turn it." That would have been believable if Harrison hadn't demonstrated solid mechanical skills during our previous work together. He'd repaired sprinkler systems and dock hardware without any confusion about basic tool usage, but now he was claiming he'd forgotten which direction tightened a bolt. "Are you feeling okay?" I'd asked. "Yeah, just tired. These monthly checks are tedious." But as we'd continued the inspection, I'd noticed other problems. The battery cables had been disconnected and left loose. The oil dipstick was missing entirely. The radio antenna had been partially unscrewed from its mount. Each time I pointed out an issue, Harrison had claimed it was an oversight or accident. Too many accidents for someone who'd been doing maintenance work competently for months. "Harrison, did you disconnect these battery cables?" "I must have bumped them while checking the oil." "The oil dipstick is gone. Did you drop it somewhere?" "It was loose when I started, probably fell into the water." "The radio antenna is barely attached." "I was testing the connection. Must have forgotten to tighten it back down." By the end of the inspection, it was clear the boat was in no condition for guest use. The engine wouldn't start. The radio was non-functional, and we'd had to spend an extra 2 hours fixing problems that shouldn't have existed in the first place. "We'll have to report this to Andrea," I'd said as we finished securing the boat. "Report what?" "The condition we found it in. She'll want to know why the monthly maintenance took so long." Harrison had gone quiet for a moment. "Maybe we don't need to give her all the details. We fixed everything, right? The boat's working now." "She's going to ask why it took 4 hours instead of 2. We can just say we were being thorough, taking our time to make sure everything was perfect." That's when I'd realized Harrison had deliberately sabotaged the boat. The disconnected cables, the missing dipstick, the loose fuel line, none of it had been accidental. He'd been systematically disabling the engine while pretending to perform routine maintenance. But why? The only explanation that made sense was that he didn't want the boat to be functional. He didn't want anyone taking it out on the water again. I'd gone along with his story when we reported to Andrea, mainly because I didn't know how to explain what I suspected. But the incident had confirmed that Harrison's behavior had crossed the line from strange to deliberately deceptive. And now this. Finding him standing motionless in the woods like some kind of sleepwalker, then having him deny it ever happened. I listened to Harrison's breathing in the next bed. It had already settled into the steady rhythm of sleep, like the conversation had never occurred. Like he genuinely believed he'd been in bed all night. Maybe he did believe it. Maybe whatever had happened during his encounter with the woman in red had affected his memory somehow. But that didn't explain the boat sabotage or his increasing possessiveness over my time. I thought about the way Harrison had stood in the forest, perfectly still with his arms at his sides. The same unnatural posture I'd observed when the woman in red had appeared on the beach. The same eerie stillness that had made her seem more like a statue than a living person. Harrison had spoken to her during those 10 minutes on the beach. I'd watched them face each other while Caden and Betty saw nothing. And ever since that conversation, Harrison had been changing. The woman was gone, but her influence wasn't. Whatever she'd said to Harrison, whatever she'd done to him during those minutes on the shore, it was still affecting him, still pulling him back toward the forest in the middle of the night. I rolled onto my side and stared at the dark window. Outside, the pine trees swayed slightly in the ocean breeze, their branches creating shifting shadows in the moonlight. Somewhere beyond those trees, deeper in the island's interior, something was waiting. Harrison's breathing remained steady and peaceful beside me. He had no memory of leaving the cabin, no awareness of standing among those trees for hours while I called his name. But his body had known where to go. And tomorrow, he'd wake up acting like nothing had happened, ready to shadow my every movement and find new reasons to keep us isolated from Caden and Betty, ready to pretend that everything was normal, while something invisible continued to pull him deeper into the island's influence. I closed my eyes but didn't expect to sleep. Whatever was happening to Harrison, I was the only one who could see it, and I had no idea how to stop it. The morning routine felt like walking through a minefield. I grabbed my jacket from the hook by the door, making sure to keep my movements casual while Harrison watched from his bed. He'd been doing that more lately, tracking every gesture, every glance toward the window. "Ready for breakfast?" I asked, forcing my voice to sound normal. Harrison swung his legs over the side of his bed and reached for his boots. "Yeah, let's go." We walked to the lodge together, but the moment we stepped inside, I made my move. "I need to grab something from the supply closet first. Meet you at the table?" His jaw tightened. "I'll come with you." "It's just cleaning supplies for the deck work. Won't take a second." I said I'll come with you. There it was again, that flat tone that didn't leave room for argument. I nodded and headed toward the storage area, feeling him right behind me. The closet smelled like pine cleaner and dust. I grabbed a bottle of deck stain, knowing we didn't need it, and Harrison stood in the doorway the entire time. Caden and Betty were already eating when we reached their table. Betty looked up with her usual smile, but I caught the slight hesitation when she saw Harrison's expression. "Morning, guys. How'd you sleep?" "Fine," I said, sitting across from her. Harrison took the chair next to me, closer than necessary. Caden pushed a plate of toast toward the center of the table. Maria made extra. Figured we could all use some carbs before tackling that fence repair. Harrison didn't reach for the toast. Actually, Parker and I should handle the fence ourselves. 2 people can manage it fine. Betty's smile faltered. "I thought Andrea wanted all of us working on the perimeter today. That's a lot of ground to cover." "We'll be more efficient with fewer people," Harrison said. "Less coordination needed." I watched Caden and Betty exchange a look. They'd been doing that more often lately, those quick glances that said they'd noticed something was off. I couldn't blame them. Harrison's insistence on keeping us separate had become impossible to ignore. "Maybe we could split into 2 teams," I suggested. "Cover more ground that way." Harrison's hand landed on my shoulder. "Parker and I work well together. We've got a system." The pressure of his fingers felt deliberate, like a warning. I took a bite of eggs and tried to think of a way to signal to Caden and Betty that I needed to talk to them alone. But Harrison never left me alone anymore. After breakfast, I excused myself to use the bathroom. Harrison started to follow, then caught himself and sat back down. I had maybe 3 minutes. I found Caden in the hallway, carrying a stack of towels toward the guest cabins. "Hey," I said, keeping my voice low. "Can I ask you something?" He stopped walking. "Sure, what's up?" "Have you noticed anything weird about Harrison lately?" Caden glanced around, making sure we were alone. "You mean how he's been acting like your shadow?" "Yeah, Betty and I were just talking about that." "It's getting worse. He won't let me work with you guys anymore. Won't let me go anywhere by myself. That's..." Caden frowned. "That's not normal, man. You're not his responsibility." "I know. But every time I try to do something on my own, he finds a reason why we should stick together. and he's been saying weird stuff about how we shouldn't trust people who want to leave the island early. Who wants to leave early? Nobody, as far as I know. That's what makes it weird. Caden shifted the towels to one arm. Maybe you should talk to Andrea. She could reassign one of you to different duties. The idea had occurred to me, but I dismissed it. Harrison would know I'd complained about him. And lately the thought of making Harrison angry seemed dangerous in a way I couldn't explain. I'll think about it, I said. Footsteps echoed from the dining area. Harrison appeared at the end of the hallway, his expression unreadable. There you are, he said. Ready to get started on that fence? Caden gave me a meaningful look before heading toward the guest cabins. I followed Harrison outside, feeling like I was being led to my own execution. The fence repair took us to the far edge of the resort property, where the wooden posts had started to rot near the ground. We worked in silence for the first hour, replacing boards and tightening wire. But I could feel Harrison watching me even when I wasn't looking directly at him. You know, he said, hammering a nail into a replacement board, Caden's been asking a lot of questions lately. I kept my focus on the wire I was stretching. What kind of questions? About the boat. About when the next ferry's coming. About whether staff can leave before their contracts are up. That wasn't true. Caden had never mentioned any of those things to me. But Harrison said it with such certainty that for a moment I wondered if I'd missed something. People get curious, I said. Doesn't mean anything. Harrison set down his hammer and looked at me directly. It means they're not committed to finishing what they started. It means they're thinking about running away when things get a little challenging. Things aren't challenging, Harrison. We're just doing maintenance work. Are we? His voice carried that flat quality again. Because it seems like everyone's looking for ways to avoid spending time together, like they're planning something. I straightened up and faced him. What would they be planning? I don't know, but I think we need to be careful about who we trust. The conversation felt like stepping into quicksand. Every response I could think of seemed likely to make things worse, so I picked up my tools and moved to the next section of fence. Harrison followed, staying close enough that I could hear his breathing. By lunchtime, I'd made a decision. I needed to talk to Betty and Caden without Harrison around, and that meant I had to create an opportunity. I'm going to grab a sandwich, I said as we finished securing the last fence post. I'll come with you. Actually, could you clean up the tools? I'll bring you something back. Harrison's eyes narrowed. I'd rather we go together. It'll be faster if we split up, 5 minutes, and then we can head back out. For a moment, I thought he might refuse. Then he nodded, but his expression stayed tense. I walked toward the lodge, forcing myself not to look back. Inside, I found Betty in the kitchen, preparing sandwiches for the afternoon shift. Hey, I said, glancing around to make sure we were alone. I need to tell you something. She looked up from the cutting board. What's wrong? You look upset. It's Harrison. He's been... I struggled to find words that didn't sound crazy. He's been acting really possessive. Won't let me work with anyone else, follows me everywhere, and now he's saying weird things about Caden asking suspicious questions. Betty set down her knife. What kind of weird things? He thinks Caden is planning to leave early, thinks you guys are plotting something behind his back. That's ridiculous. Caden and I haven't said anything about leaving. I know, but Harrison seems convinced that anyone who wants space or privacy is up to something dangerous. Betty wiped her hands on her apron, her expression troubled. Parker, that's not normal behavior. That's... She paused, searching for the right word. That's controlling. Maybe you should talk to Andrea. I'm worried about what Harrison might do if he thinks I'm complaining about him. What do you mean, what he might do? Before I could answer, footsteps approached the kitchen. Harrison appeared in the doorway, his gaze moving between Betty and me. Ready to head back out? He asked. Just grabbing lunch, I said, reaching for a sandwich Betty had prepared. Harrison stepped into the kitchen. What were you two talking about? Betty's smile looked forced. Just discussing the dinner menu for tonight. Really? Because it looked like a pretty serious conversation for menu planning. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Betty busied herself wrapping sandwiches, and I could see her hands shaking slightly. We should get back to work, I said. Harrison nodded, but his attention stayed on Betty. You know, Betty, if there's something bothering you about how things are going around here, you can talk to me about it. We're all part of the same team. Everything's fine, she said quickly. Just focused on getting through the busy season. Good. Because it would be a shame if anyone felt like they needed to make changes to their situation here. The island's a special place. Deserves people who appreciate what it offers. The way he said it made my skin crawl. There was something almost threatening in his tone, despite the friendly words. We left Betty in the kitchen and walked back toward the fence line. But instead of continuing our repair work, Harrison suggested we check on the boat dock. Why? I asked. Just want to make sure everything's secure. Weather's been rough lately. That wasn't true. The weather had been calm for days, but I followed him down to the marina, trying to figure out what he really wanted. The boat sat in its slip, looking exactly as we'd left it after Harrison's sabotage. He walked around the dock, checking cleats and rope tension with exaggerated care. You know, he said, crouching next to the engine housing, it's probably good that this boat isn't running right now. Why's that? People might get ideas about taking trips they shouldn't take. I watched him run his hands over the engine cover. What kind of trips? The kind that end badly. Water can be dangerous, especially for people who don't know what they're doing. We all know how to swim, Harrison. He stood up and looked at me. Swimming doesn't help if you're too far from shore, or if your engine fails in rough water, or if you encounter something unexpected out there. Something unexpected. Like a woman in a red dress standing on a beach where no one should be. The boat's fine here, he continued. Safe. Just like we're all safer when we stick together on the island. I nodded, but my mind was racing. Harrison wasn't just preventing us from using the boat. He was making sure I understood that he'd prevent us from using it. That evening, I skipped dinner in the main lodge. I told Harrison I wasn't feeling well and needed to rest in the cabin. He offered to bring me food, but I insisted I just wanted to sleep. Once he left for dinner, I had maybe an hour before he'd return to check on me. I slipped out of the cabin and made my way to the communications room in the lodge's administrative wing. Andrea had shown us the radio setup during our first week, a marine radio for emergencies and a satellite phone for mainland contact. The door was locked. I tried the handle again, thinking maybe it was just stuck. But no, definitely locked. And not just locked. There was a new deadbolt that hadn't been there before. I walked around to the window and peered inside. The room was dark, but I could make out the radio equipment on the desk. At least, I could make out the desk. The radio itself was gone. My stomach dropped. Harrison had been busy. I checked the window latch, but it was secure. Breaking in would leave obvious evidence, and I wasn't ready for that confrontation yet. Footsteps crunched on gravel behind me. I turned to see Harrison walking back from the lodge, carrying a plate covered with a napkin. Feeling better? He asked. A little, just needed some air. He handed me the plate. Brought you dinner. Betty made extra meatloaf. Thanks. We walked back to the cabin together. Harrison seemed relaxed, almost cheerful, like a problem had been solved. Inside, I picked at the meatloaf while Harrison read a book on his bed. The normalcy of it felt surreal. Harrison, I said finally. Yeah? When's the next ferry supposed to come? He looked up from his book. 2 weeks, I think. Why? Just wondering. You're not thinking about leaving early, are you? The question sounded casual, but there was something sharp underneath it. No, I said. Just keeping track of time. Good. because I think we've got a really good thing going here, all of us. It would be a shame to break that up before the summer's over." He went back to his book, but I could feel his attention on me. I finished eating and got ready for bed, going through all the normal motions, but my mind was working furiously. Harrison had hidden the radio equipment. The boat was sabotaged. The next ferry wouldn't arrive for 2 weeks, and Harrison was watching my every move. I was trapped, but Harrison didn't know that I knew I was trapped. That gave me an advantage, as long as I could keep pretending everything was normal. I lay in bed listening to Harrison's breathing even out as he fell asleep. Then I started planning. First, I needed to find where he'd hidden the radio. Second, I needed to figure out if the boat could be repaired without him knowing. Third, I needed to warn Caden and Betty without alerting Harrison. And I needed to do all of it while acting like nothing had changed. Because whatever was happening to Harrison, whatever the woman in red had done to him on that beach, it was getting stronger. His obsession with keeping us together, his paranoia about people leaving, his systematic elimination of escape routes, it all pointed to something that went beyond normal jealousy or control issues. Harrison stirred in his sleep, muttering something I couldn't understand. In the darkness, his breathing sounded different, deeper, like he was somewhere else entirely. I closed my eyes and tried to think of a plan that would get us all off this island before Harrison's behavior escalated into something more dangerous. My eyes snapped open in the darkness. Harrison's breathing had settled into that deep, steady rhythm I'd learned to recognize over the past few days. The same pattern that meant he was actually asleep, not just pretending. I waited another 10 minutes, counting each breath to make sure. The cabin felt smaller at night, like the walls had moved closer while we weren't paying attention. Harrison's face looked peaceful in the dim light filtering through our single window. Nothing like the tense, watchful expression he wore during the day. Moving carefully, I slipped out of bed. The floorboards creaked under my feet, and I froze, listening. Harrison didn't stir. I grabbed my jacket from the chair and pulled on my boots, lacing them as quietly as possible. My wallet went into my back pocket along with the small flashlight I kept on my nightstand. The door handle turned slowly under my hand. I eased it open just enough to slip through, then closed it behind me with barely a click. Outside, the night air hit my face like a cold slap. The moon was 3/4 full, casting everything in silver and black shadows. I took a deep breath and started walking toward the dock. Each step felt deliberate, like I was crossing some invisible line. Behind me, the cabin stayed dark and quiet. No movement at the windows. Harrison was still asleep. The path to the marina wound through a small grove of pine trees, their branches forming a canopy overhead that blocked most of the moonlight. I kept my flashlight off, not wanting to risk the beam giving me away. My boots crunched softly on the gravel, and somewhere in the distance I could hear waves lapping against the shore. When I reached the dock, the boat sat exactly where we'd left it that afternoon. The 22-foot center console looked bigger in the darkness, its white hull almost glowing in the moonlight. I climbed aboard and made my way to the engine compartment in the stern. The cover lifted easily, revealing the outboard motor Harrison had systematically sabotaged. I pulled out my flashlight and switched it on, keeping the beam low and shielded with my hand. The damage was exactly as I remembered it from my earlier inspection. Fuel line disconnected. Battery cables loose. Oil dipstick missing. Radio antenna partially unscrewed. I started with the fuel line, reconnecting it to the engine intake. The coupling clicked into place with a satisfying snap. Next came the battery cables, which I tightened with my fingers until they felt secure. The oil dipstick had been tossed into the storage compartment under the console. I found it wedged behind a spare life jacket and screwed it back into place. The radio antenna took longer. Harrison had loosened it just enough to break the connection without making it obvious. I climbed onto the console and twisted it clockwise until it felt tight. The radio crackled to life when I tested it, picking up faint chatter from fishing boats somewhere out on the water. I checked the fuel gauge. Half full. Enough to reach the mainland if the engine cooperated. The key was still in the ignition where Harrison had left it after our last official maintenance check. My hands shook as I turned the key. The engine cranked once, twice, then caught with a rough cough. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the quiet night, echoing off the water and bouncing back from the trees on shore. I winced and quickly adjusted the throttle to idle, bringing the noise down to a low rumble. The engine sputtered and missed, then smoothed out slightly. It didn't sound healthy, but it was running. I had no idea how long it would keep going, or if Harrison's sabotage had caused damage I couldn't see. But it was working now, and that was all I needed. I untied the dock lines, starting with the stern and working my way forward. The boat drifted away from the dock as I cast off the last line, the current carrying us slowly toward open water. I climbed back to the helm and put the engine in gear. The boat moved forward with another cough from the motor. I kept the throttle low, not wanting to push my luck or make more noise than necessary. We cleared the marina and entered the main channel between Clearwater Island and the mainland. Behind me, the resort buildings grew smaller. The main lodge was a dark bulk against the trees, with only a few security lights marking the paths between cabins. Everything looked peaceful and normal, like a postcard of a perfect island getaway. That's when I heard my name. Parker. The voice carried across the water, faint but unmistakable. Harrison. I looked back toward the dock and saw a figure running down the path from the cabins. Even at this distance, I could make out his distinctive height and the way he moved. Parker, where are you going? I pushed the throttle forward slightly. The engine responded with a series of coughs and a small cloud of black smoke, but our speed increased. The gap between the boat and the island widened. Harrison reached the dock and stopped at the end, hands cupped around his mouth. Come back. You don't understand. His voice sounded desperate, almost panicked, nothing like the calm, controlling tone he'd been using for days. I kept the boat pointed toward the mainland, watching the compass on the dashboard to maintain our heading. Parker, she's here. She wants to talk to you. That made me push the throttle even further. The engine protested with more smoke and an alarming grinding noise, but we kept moving. The mainland was still just a line of lights on the horizon, but we were making progress. I looked back one more time, expecting to see Harrison alone on the dock. Instead, I saw two figures standing side by side at the water's edge. Harrison and someone else. Someone in a bright red dress that seemed to glow in the moonlight. The woman from the woods. The one Harrison claimed he couldn't see until our boat trip. She stood perfectly still beside him, both of them facing the water. Facing me. Even across the dark water with at least 100 yards between us now, I could see her face clearly, pale skin that looked almost white in the moonlight. Dark hair hanging straight and motionless despite the breeze I could feel on my own face. And her mouth. Her mouth was stretched into a grin that seemed to split her face from ear to ear. Too wide for any human face. The kind of smile that belonged in nightmares, not on a real person standing on a real dock. But I could see it clearly. As if she was standing right next to me instead of fading into the distance. The details were sharp and wrong and impossible to ignore. Her teeth looked too numerous, too white, arranged in rows that went back further than they should. I turned away and focused on the compass, on the engine gauges, on anything except the two figures watching from the shore. The mainland lights were getting closer. The engine was still running, still pushing us forward despite the occasional miss and the smell of burning oil. Whatever had been controlling Harrison, whatever had been influencing his behavior since our boat trip, it was still back there on the island, standing next to him, watching me leave with that horrible, impossible smile. The boat coughed and lurched, the engine missing several beats before catching again. I held my breath, waiting for it to die completely and leave me stranded in the middle of the channel. But it kept running, carrying me away from Clearwater Island and toward the safety of the mainland. I didn't look back again. The engine gave one final, shuddering cough and died completely. I turned the key again and again, but nothing happened. The silence felt sudden and wrong after the grinding noise that had been carrying me across the channel. I checked the fuel gauge. Empty. Harrison's sabotage had been more thorough than I'd realized. The fuel line must have been leaking the entire time, draining what little gas we'd had left in the tank. I was maybe half a mile from the mainland shore, close enough to see individual lights in windows, but still surrounded by dark, cold water. The boat drifted with the current, which seemed to be pulling me toward a cluster of docks on the mainland side. I could make out the shapes of fishing boats and what looked like a small marina. The water looked black and uninviting, but I didn't have much choice. Swimming in the Pacific Northwest wasn't exactly appealing, but staying in a dead boat wasn't going to get me anywhere. I kicked off my boots and pulled off my jacket. The night air hit my skin and made me shiver immediately. The water would be worse. I'd grown up swimming in lakes back home, but this was ocean water in late spring. Cold enough to kill me if I took too long getting to shore. I climbed over the side of the boat and dropped into the water. The cold hit me like a physical blow. My whole body seized up for a moment, and I had to fight not to gasp and suck in water. The current was stronger than I'd expected, pulling me sideways as much as forward. I started swimming toward the lights, trying to keep my breathing steady and my strokes even. My clothes weighed me down, but I didn't want to waste time treading water to take them off. The marina looked closer now, maybe a quarter mile. I could make it. I had to make it. The cold worked its way into my muscles, making each stroke harder than the last. My legs felt heavy and clumsy. I focused on the dock lights ahead of me, counting strokes to keep my mind occupied. 20 strokes, 30, 40. The lights were definitely getting bigger. Something brushed against my leg in the water, and I nearly panicked before realizing it was probably just seaweed. I kept swimming, forcing myself not to think about what else might be in the water with me. Just the lights ahead, just getting to shore. My hands finally hit something solid, a wooden piling covered in barnacles that scraped my palms as I grabbed on. I worked my way along the pilings until I found a ladder built into the side of the dock. My arms shook as I pulled myself up, water streaming from my clothes. I lay on the dock for a few minutes, shivering and catching my breath. The marina was small, maybe a dozen slips with fishing boats and a couple of sailboats. A single light burned in what looked like a harbor master's office at the end of the pier. I got to my feet and walked toward the light, my wet socks squelching in my shoes. The office door was unlocked. Inside, I found a desk with a marine radio and a phone. An old guy in a flannel shirt looked up from a cup of coffee and a paperback novel. "Jesus, son, what happened to you?" "I need to call the Coast Guard," I said. My teeth were chattering so hard I could barely get the words out. He handed me a towel from behind the desk and pointed to the phone. "You fall off a boat?" "Something like that." I dialed the Coast Guard emergency number I'd memorized during our safety briefing at the resort. When someone answered, I tried to keep my voice steady. "This is Parker Guzman. I need to report a situation on Clearwater Island Resort. There are people in danger." The Coast Guard operator asked for my location and the nature of the emergency. I gave him the marina address, which the harbor master confirmed, and then tried to explain what had happened without sounding completely insane. "There's a man named Harrison Hunt who's been acting erratically and making threats. He sabotaged our boat to prevent people from leaving the island. There are 2 other staff members there, Caden Walker and Betty Perry, and I'm concerned for their safety." "Are you reporting a hostage situation, sir?" I paused. Was that what this was? I don't know. Maybe. Harrison's behavior changed after he encountered someone on the island, a woman. But there's something wrong with her, something not normal. The operator asked me to stay on the line while he contacted the local Coast Guard station. The harbor master brought me another towel and a cup of coffee that burned my throat but helped stop the shivering. 20 minutes later, a Coast Guard patrol boat arrived at the marina. 2 officers took my statement while a third radioed ahead to the station. I told them everything I could remember about Harrison's behavior, the sabotaged boat, the missing radio equipment, and the woman in the red dress. I described Caden and Betty, gave them physical descriptions and background information, and explained the layout of the resort. "We'll need you to come with us to the station to file a formal report," one of the officers said, "and we'll want you to speak with our investigators." I spent the next 6 hours at the Coast Guard station going over every detail of what had happened on the island. They asked about Harrison's mental health history, whether he'd made specific threats, and whether I thought he was armed. I told them about the tool shed and the maintenance equipment, but I couldn't remember seeing any actual weapons. The hardest part was explaining the woman in the red dress. How do you tell federal investigators that you think something supernatural is controlling your coworker? I stuck to the facts I could prove. Harrison had seen her during our boat trip. His behavior had changed immediately afterward. He'd become possessive and paranoid, isolating me from the other staff members and sabotaging our escape routes. "Did you actually see this woman harm anyone?" the investigator asked. "No, but Harrison stood in the woods talking to her, and afterward he wasn't the same person." They took notes but didn't ask follow-up questions about that part of my story. I could tell they thought the woman was probably just a guest or someone from a nearby island who had triggered some kind of mental breakdown in Harrison. The Coast Guard launched their investigation the next morning. 2 boats approached Clearwater Island from different directions while a helicopter circled overhead. I waited at the station, drinking coffee and watching the radio chatter. The first report came in around noon. "Resort appears occupied, 1 male subject visible at the main lodge." An hour later. "Subject identified as Harrison Hunt, claims to be alone on the island, says other staff members left without notice 2 days ago." I grabbed the radio microphone. "That's not true. Caden and Betty wouldn't just leave. Ask him where they went." The Coast Guard officer on the boat relayed my question. Harrison's response came back a few minutes later. "Hunt says Walker and Perry took the boat to the mainland and never returned. Claims he's been waiting for pickup. The boat is here," I said. "It's the one I used to escape. Harrison sabotaged it." They searched the island for the rest of the day. Every building, every trail, every possible hiding place. They found no sign of Caden Walker or Betty Perry. No luggage, no personal belongings, no indication they'd ever been there at all. The investigators checked guest records and ferry logs, but there was no record of either of them leaving the island. Harrison stuck to his story. He seemed calm and rational during questioning, expressing concern about my mental state and suggesting that isolation might have affected my judgment. He denied sabotaging the boat, claimed he'd never seen a woman in a red dress, and insisted that Caden and Betty had simply decided to leave early. "He's lying," I told the investigators. "I worked with those people for weeks. I know they were there." But without evidence, there wasn't much the Coast Guard could do. They questioned Harrison for hours, searched his belongings, and examined every inch of the resort. They found nothing suspicious except for the missing radio equipment, which Harrison claimed had been removed for repairs. The case stayed open for 2 weeks, while they searched the surrounding waters and contacted law enforcement agencies across the Pacific Northwest. No one matching Caden's or Betty's descriptions had been seen anywhere. No bodies washed up on nearby shores. It was as if they had simply vanished. I stayed on the mainland, living in a cheap motel while I gave statement after statement to different investigators. Local police, FBI, Coast Guard criminal investigators. They all asked the same questions and got the same answers. Harrison Hunt was the only person found on Clearwater Island, and there was no evidence that Caden Walker and Betty Perry had ever existed, except I knew they had. I remembered Betty's laugh when Harrison told bad jokes at dinner. I remembered Caden showing me how to fold fitted sheets properly when we changed beds in the guest cabins. I remembered working alongside both of them, eating meals together, playing cards in the evening. But memories aren't evidence, and the investigation eventually went cold. Harrison was released after questioning. The Coast Guard found no grounds to hold him, and he'd committed no provable crime. The resort reopened a few weeks later under new management, and Harrison disappeared from my life completely. I never saw him again, never heard what happened to him after he left the island. I tried to move on, found a job in construction back home, started saving money, dated a girl from work for a few months. But I couldn't stop thinking about Caden and Betty. What had happened to them? Had they suffered? Had they been afraid? Sometimes I'd wake up at night thinking about the woman in the red dress, that impossible smile, those too many teeth. I'd wonder if she was still on the island, waiting for the next group of seasonal workers to arrive, waiting for someone new to influence, someone new to control. I never went back to Clearwater Island, never even looked it up online or checked whether it was still operating as a resort. Some things are better left alone, better left in the past where they can't reach you. But I carried the weight of not knowing what had happened to my friends, Caden with his easy laugh and his stories about growing up in California, Betty with her endless optimism and her terrible taste in movies. They deserved better than to simply disappear without a trace, to be forgotten by everyone except me. The official report listed them as missing persons, cases that remained open but inactive. I was the only witness to their existence on that island, the only person who remembered they'd been there at all. And sometimes, in the darkest moments, I wondered if I was losing my mind. If maybe Harrison had been telling the truth and I'd imagined the whole thing. But then I'd remember Betty singing while she worked in the kitchen, or Caden's concentrated expression when he taught me the right way to make hospital corners on a bed. Those memories were too real, too detailed to be hallucinations. I finished my recovery on the mainland, working construction jobs and trying to build a normal life. But I was never quite the same person I'd been before Clearwater Island. The experience had changed something fundamental in me, left me always looking over my shoulder, always wondering what might be hiding just out of sight. The Pacific Northwest felt different now. Every island looked potentially dangerous. Every isolated place seemed like it might be hiding something that shouldn't exist. I'd learned that there were things in the world that didn't follow normal rules, things that could reach out and change people in ways that left no evidence behind. And I'd learned that sometimes, no matter how hard you try to help, no matter how much you care about someone, you can't save them from forces you don't understand. All you can do is survive, remember? And carry their memory forward into whatever comes next.